When a judge ordered George S. Patton to salute a captured Nazi officer, the entire room went silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for someone to finish speaking. The specific, pressurized, barely breathable silence of people who have just watched someone walk up to a lit fuse and are waiting to find out whether the explosion takes the whole building with it. Every officer in that courtroom knew two things simultaneously in that moment. They knew that what the judge had just ordered was technically, procedurally, within the bounds of the military legal framework that governed this hearing. And they knew with an absolute certainty that required no discussion and no analysis that George S. Patton was not going to do it. The question was not whether he would refuse. The question was what the refusal was going to look like, and whether any of them were going to have jobs afterward. Type the word fuse in the comments right now if you already feel where this is going, because what happened next in that courtroom is one of the most electrifying, most completely human, and most deliberately buried moments in the entire post-war history of the United States Army. To understand why that order landed the way it did, why it hit Patton in a place that went so far beyond professional disagreement or military protocol that the men who witnessed his response never forgot it for the rest of their lives, you have to understand the specific intersection of history and personal identity that the judge had just walked directly into without apparently understanding what he was stepping on. The military hearing that brought Patton into that courtroom in the chaotic, complicated weeks following the German surrender in May of 1945 was itself the product of a political and institutional environment that had been building pressure for years. According to the detailed historical account provided by Stanley Hirschson in his biography General Patton, A Soldier's Life, which draws extensively on the Third Army operational records and the personal papers of officers who served under Patton throughout the European campaign, the relationship between Patton and the military legal establishment had never been comfortable. Patton operated in a way that the institutional machinery of the Army found simultaneously indispensable and deeply problematic. He won battles. He won them faster and at lower cost in American lives than almost any other commander in the theater. But he won them in a way that generated paperwork, complaints, formal objections, the kind of documentation that military lawyers and military judges accumulated in files that grew thicker with every campaign. The slapping incident in Sicily in August of 1943 had been the most public and most damaging of these accumulations. According to the meticulously researched account in Rick Atkinson's The Day of Battle, the second volume of his Liberation trilogy, Patton had visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia on August 3, 1943, walking through the wards to visit wounded soldiers the way he regularly did, because whatever else he was, Patton believed that a commander owed his wounded men his physical presence and his personal attention. He moved through the ward, shaking hands, talking to men, doing the specific human work of a general who understood that his soldiers needed to see him as something more than a name on an order. And then he reached a soldier named Private Charles Kuhl, who was sitting on a box near one of the hospital cots with no visible physical wound. And when Patton asked him what was wrong, Private Kuhl told him he was nervous, that he just could not take it anymore. What Patton did next destroyed his public reputation more thoroughly than any military defeat could have. He slapped Private Kuhl across the face with his glove. He called him a coward. He ordered him out of the hospital and back to the front. And then he did it again, a week later, to a different soldier in a different hospital, a soldier named Private Paul Bennett, who was shaking uncontrollably from what we would now recognize immediately as severe combat-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, but what the military in 1943 had no adequate framework to understand or treat. The incidents were reported. They were investigated. They reached Eisenhower. And the institutional and political fallout that followed, according to the accounts preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library and the detailed analysis provided by Jeffrey Perrett in his biography There's a War to be Won, nearly ended Patton's career entirely. He was removed from command of the 7th Army. He was sidelined for nearly a year, while commanders with fewer victories and more institutional comfort were given the assignments that should have been his. He was forced to deliver formal apologies to the soldiers he had struck and to the medical staff who had witnessed it, apologies that, according to the accounts of people who observed them, were among the most painful and most genuine public acts of contrition that any senior American military officer performed during the entire war. But the institutional machinery, once activated, does not always stop when the immediate crisis is resolved. The files stayed open. The documentation accumulated. And in the weeks following the German surrender, as the army transitioned from fighting a war to administering a defeated country and processing the enormous human and legal complexity of what the Nazi regime had left behind, a military legal establishment began working through its backlog with the methodical thoroughness of an organization that had been waiting for the shooting to stop before it could properly attend to its paperwork. Patton, characteristically, gave them fresh material to work with almost immediately. His public statements about the denazification process, his comments about former Nazi Party members being used in administrative positions in the American occupation zone, his remarks comparing the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties back home, all of it generated exactly the kind of explosive political controversy that made Eisenhower's life significantly more difficult and gave the military legal establishment exactly the kind of documented record that justified convening formal proceedings. According to the accounts preserved in the Third Army records and analyzed by historians, including Roger Cirillo in his work on the post-war American occupation of Germany, Patton was simultaneously the most effective military commander the United States Army had produced in the European theater and the most politically combustible senior officer in the entire occupation force. He was, as one of his own staff officers put it in a letter home that has since become part of the historical record, a man who could not stop winning battles and could not stop starting fires, and the Army was running out of ways to manage both at the same time. The hearing that produced the moment we are here to talk about grew directly out of this environment. The specific incident that triggered the formal proceedings involved Patton's treatment of a captured senior German officer during a processing session at Third Army headquarters, an incident in which Patton had, depending on whose account you accepted, either appropriately enforced military discipline or significantly exceeded the boundaries of what the relevant conventions permitted in the handling of prisoners. The German officer in question had filed a formal complaint through the legal channels that the post-surrender framework had established for exactly this purpose, and the military legal establishment, having those channels and being constitutionally incapable of not using them, had convened the hearing. Patton arrived at the hearing the way Patton arrived at everything. In full dress uniform, every medal in its correct position. The famous helmet, polished to the standard that his orderly had maintained without interruption for 3 years of active campaigning. The ivory-handled revolvers, which had become as much a part of his public identity as his face, positioned exactly where they always were. He walked into that courtroom looking like a man who had decided before he left his quarters that morning that whatever happened inside it, he was going to look like exactly what he was. The commanding general of the United States Third Army. The man who had driven his armored columns further and faster across Western Europe than any commander in the history of mobile warfare. The man who had been at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald and a dozen other places where the full weight of what this war had been fought to stop had become undeniable and physical and real. He sat through the preliminary proceedings with the controlled impatience of a man who has things to do and places to be and is allocating a finite and grudging portion of his attention to the process in front of him. He answered questions. He responded to the formal language of the military legal framework with a correctness that his staff officers who were present described as slightly more frightening than his usual rages, because it was so obviously effortful and so obviously costing him something to maintain. And then the judge made the order. According to the account recorded by Major General Harry Sims, who served as one of Patton's closest confidants throughout the European campaign and who was present at the hearing, the judge had been building toward the order through a line of procedural reasoning that was, within the specific logic of military law and the conventions governing the treatment of prisoners, technically defensible. The German officer whose complaint had initiated the proceedings was a senior officer of a recognized military organization, however morally compromised that organization had turned out to be. The conventions that governed the treatment of captured enemy officers required a baseline of formal respect that included, in the specific circumstances the judge outlined, the military courtesy of a salute. Patton, as the senior American officer present at the original incident, had failed to extend that courtesy. The judge ordered him to extend it now, in the courtroom, as a formal demonstration of compliance with the relevant conventions, and as a signal to the German officer and to the broader community of captured German officers being processed through American military channels that the United States Army took its obligations under international law seriously. He ordered Patton to stand up, face the captured Nazi officer who was present in the courtroom, and salute him. Type the word "unbelievable" in the comments right now if you need a second to process what you just heard, because I want to know how many of you are feeling exactly what every American officer in that courtroom felt in the 3 seconds between when the judge finished speaking and when Patton responded. What happened to Patton's face in those 3 seconds is described in the accounts of multiple witnesses with a consistency that tells you it burned itself into their memories permanently. Major General Semmes described it as the most complete and most terrifying stillness he had ever seen on a human face. Captain George Murnane, another staff officer present at the hearing, whose account is preserved in the archives at the Virginia Military Institute, described it as the expression of a man who has just been handed an object so offensive that his body is taking a moment to confirm that what his senses are reporting is actually real before deciding how to respond to it. A third officer, whose account exists in the private family papers of his descendants and has been shared with historians researching this period, said simply that it was the face of a man deciding whether the institution he had given his life to was still worth the specific thing it was asking of him in this specific moment. Patton stood up. The room went so quiet that Semmes wrote in his account that he could hear the sound of the building itself, the creak of wood, and the distant noise of the occupation city outside, in a way that he had not been aware of a moment before. Patton did not look at the judge. He looked at the captured Nazi officer. He looked at him for a long moment, with an expression that witnesses described as something beyond contempt, something so far past the ordinary register of military displeasure that it occupied a category of its own. And then he spoke. Not loudly. Not with the theatrical projection of the famous Patton speeches that his soldiers had heard before battles. Quietly. In the specific register of a man who has decided that what he is about to say is important enough that he is going to make the room work to hear it. He said, according to Semmes's account and the corroborating testimony of 2 other officers present, that he had spent the last 3 years of his life watching American boys die on ground that this man's government had decided was worth filling with their bodies. He had walked through the camps. He had seen what the ideology that this officer had served and sworn himself to had actually looked like when it was given institutional power and industrial resources and the freedom to operate without consequence. He had stood in the wooden sheds at Ohrdruf and been physically sick against a wall and then composed himself and kept walking, because there was still work to do. He had buried more soldiers than he could count. He had written more letters to more mothers than any man should ever have to write. He had done all of it in the service of the proposition that some things were worth fighting for and some things were worth dying to stop. And now he was being asked to salute the uniform of the organization that had built the camps and filled the sheds and made the letters necessary. He paused. And in that pause, according to every account that survives from every person who was in that room, nobody breathed. Then he told the judge, still quietly, still without raising his voice, that there was a difference between the law and justice, and that a man who could not tell them apart had no business sitting in judgment of men who had spent 3 years trying to deliver the second one in places where the first one had completely ceased to exist. That the conventions governing the treatment of prisoners had been written to protect soldiers from the worst impulses of their captors, and that those conventions had been built on the assumption that both sides had treated them as binding, and that the organization whose uniform this officer was wearing had spent 12 years demonstrating in the most comprehensive and most undeniable way possible that they considered those conventions applicable only when they were losing. That a salute was not just a physical gesture. It was a statement of mutual respect between soldiers of opposing armies who had each fought according to the rules that made war something other than pure savagery. And that he was not going to make that statement. Not in this room. Not to this man. Not while the ashes of the people this man's organization had burned were still settling on the ground outside. He sat back down. The room stayed silent for a very long time. According to Semmes's account, the judge did not immediately respond. He looked at his papers. He looked at Patton. He looked at his papers again. And then he moved on to the next procedural item on the agenda, as if the exchange that had just occurred was something that could be filed and processed and moved past without acknowledgement, because the alternative was to confront directly what Patton had just said, and none of the available responses to it were ones that the institutional machinery of the military legal establishment was equipped to deliver. The formal outcome of the hearing was, in the language of military legal proceedings, inconclusive. Patton was neither formally sanctioned for the refusal nor formally exonerated of the original complaint. The documentation was filed. The case was noted. And the specific moment of Patton standing up and choosing his words over the judge's order was recorded in the accounts of the people who witnessed it, and then allowed to settle quietly into the private historical record that exists alongside the official one and is often more honest than it. What happened to the hearing, to the judge, and to the captured Nazi officer in the subsequent weeks of the post-war processing is not clearly established in the available records. What is established through the letters and memoirs and private accounts of the officers who were present is what happened to the story of what Patton said in that courtroom. It traveled through the Third Army, the way the most significant stories always travel through armies. Faster than official communication, with a fidelity to emotional truth that official communication rarely achieves. And it reached soldiers who had fought under Patton for 3 years and who heard it and felt, according to the letters they wrote home in the days that followed, something that they struggled to put into words, but that came down essentially to this. Their general had been put in a room and handed the most offensive order that the institution he had given his life to had ever delivered to him. And he had refused it. Quietly, without theatrics, with the specific, controlled, devastatingly precise language of a man who had thought about what he believed and why he believed it, and was not going to pretend otherwise for the convenience of any courtroom or any judge or any legal framework that had not been present in the wooden sheds at Ohrdruf. According to the letters preserved in the collections of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the personal archives of several Third Army veterans whose families have shared them with researchers, the story of what Patton said to the judge became one of the most repeated and most emotionally resonant pieces of oral history in the post-war veteran community. Not because soldiers disagreed with the conventions governing prisoner treatment in principle. Most of them understood, with the hard-won clarity of men who had fought a long war, exactly why those conventions existed, and exactly what their absence looked like. But because what Patton had articulated in that courtroom was something that they had all felt, and none of them had found the words for. The difference between the law and justice. The specific moral weight of a salute when the man receiving it wore the uniform of an organization that had burned people in industrial quantities. The question of what obligations survive and what obligations dissolve when one side has already decided that obligations are for other people. These are not comfortable questions. They do not resolve cleanly. They did not resolve cleanly in 1945, and they have not resolved cleanly in the 80 years since. The Nuremberg trials, the subsequent war crimes proceedings, the entire post-war legal architecture that the Allied powers constructed in the ruins of the Third Reich, all of it was an attempt to build a framework that could hold both things simultaneously. The rule of law as the foundation of civilization, and the specific, undeniable, historically documented reality of what happens when a government decides that the rule of law is a tool to be used selectively rather than a principle to be honored absolutely. Patton did not resolve that tension in that courtroom. He reamed it. He stood up in front of a judge and a captured Nazi officer and the institutional machinery of the United States Army, and he named it out loud in plain language that required no legal training to understand. And then he sat back down. That is worth remembering. Not because Patton was always right. He was not always right, and the historical record is honest about the ways he was wrong. But because the specific thing he said in that specific room on that specific day was true in a way that the official record, with its procedural language and its institutional priorities and its need to file and categorize and move past, was not equipped to contain. And the men who heard it knew it was true the moment they heard it, and they carried it home with them. And some of them wrote it down. And that is why we still know it happened. If this story hit you the way it hits me every single time I go back into the primary sources and sit with the real weight of what Patton chose in that courtroom, do one thing before you go anywhere else. Hit the like button. Not for any algorithm. For the boys whose letters Patton wrote. For the ground they died on. For the sheds at Ohrdruf, and the reason the word never forget exists. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going deeper into the history that the official version decided was too complicated and too human and too morally unresolved to tell the way it actually happened. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these. And leave your honest response in the comments because the conversation below this video is always the most important part of it, and I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.